Okay, I'm going to talk a bit about the Seagrass-Watch program now. So, most people are aware of Seagrass-Watch. We've been around, is it still working? We've been around for about 20 years. So I'd like to give you that sort of background on what the program is and where it's gone and where it's at. So the program itself started in March 1998, and it really is a participatory seagrass monitoring and science-based education program. The reason I use that is it's often referred to as a community-based monitoring program, but to be honest, that's a bit last century. Things have moved on since then. There are a number of objectives that we have in the program, and a lot of those are built around things like education, raising awareness and building capacity, particularly of local stakeholders, and then the ability to conduct long-term monitoring, that to provide an early warning of what's going on in these systems, and then finally to support conservation measures, which is all about the long-term resilience of seagrass ecosystems. The way the program's structured, it has two major components, if you like. There is the monitoring and assessment, and then there's the engagement and science-based education component. Within the monitoring and assessment component, this is predominantly now where we have scientists and environmental practitioners who are conducting monitoring and research, and as they voluntarily contribute their data into the larger global database. We also have an important component of where the scientists are working with schools and with communities, so this is where we're helping to provide information and background for things such as curricula, and also building that capacity of our local stakeholders so that they themselves will have the ability to lobby and provide advocacy for protection and conservation of seagrass. And bridging those two is where we have the role of citizen scientists, where they themselves can provide that engagement and work with the broader community and stakeholders. But there's also the opportunity where they can also contribute to the long-term monitoring, be either at the entry level or the novice level, where we have things now such as Seagrass Spotter, which they can use, or there is the amateur citizen scientist who can then partner with scientists themselves, professional scientists and environmental practitioners, and they can assist with the long-term monitoring that may be occurring at the local level. All of that information then folds down into making sure that monitoring and assessment data provides that evidence-based information we need for management and policy, and we're also building to raise the awareness and outreach within our local communities. There's about 32 countries at the moment that are participating in the program. Some of those places are only doing so at the education level. There are others who are monitoring, and monitoring can be, for some places, only a couple of years. For others, it may be more than 3 years. So it depends on the questions and what's actually going on in those, each of those places. Who participates? Anything from universities, research institutions, government agencies, non-government organisations, local citizens and community groups, and we do have an important part of also trying to work with schools as part of the education component. Things where we have like the community groups where we go out and engage the broader community. This is where they can conduct field days. So we can provide some of that background information, but it's really driven by those local communities who, once themselves have built some capacity, they then engage the broader community at that local level. So they can do things like field days at festivals. There's also education days where we work with school teachers and they'll take their students out, teach them a bit about science, the importance in these systems. And we also run things like introductory workshops where we try to introduce people to that long-term monitoring and the techniques that we use to basically gauge, they themselves might be interested, do I want to continue with this in future? So this is once again, building that capacity, giving them a trial of the methods. Is this something you want to do, or would you just prefer to remain in the engagement field? So we provide all that information as part of the program. In terms of the monitoring and assessment component, the actual long-term monitoring program started in August 1999. And the program really just responds to local needs. So we don't actively go out and say to someone, we would like to know about the condition of seagrass in this region, can someone come forward and do it? We very much make it aware that we're out there, but if the interest has to come from local, because that's very important for sustainability in any of these programs. The conditions are getting quite more rigid these days, and that is the data collection must be overseen by either a qualified scientist or a trained and competent participant. And any of the data it's collected has to be done so by individuals which are adults, so 18 years and over. The cornerstone of the program is the Seagrass-Watch headquarters, and we certainly provide that scientific underpinning and advice. We provide the networking where we can link communities together with local scientists, so certainly working closely with things like the World Seagrass Association and other networks. It helps us provide and link people together. Most of the work we do is remote assistance, so you see a lot of countries appear up there. I certainly haven't been to them all. If there is any funding available, we can provide that on-ground training. The way it works is pretty much if people want to get involved, they need to decide on their level of commitment, and then we have this sort of 7-step process where you register with the program, you can then partner up with a scientist or an environmental practitioner. Then we start looking at things such as, do you have the training? Do you have the right equipment? You can then go out and collect that data. You can then submit it to Seagrass-Watch headquarters, where we run that quality assurance and quality control on that data, and then provide the feedback, and then people continue on with their frequency of sampling. Depending on the questions they have, they're asking whether that frequency is every couple of months or whether it's once a year or something like that. We do provide capacity building. We do realise that no matter whether they're scientists, environmental practitioners, or the broader community, they still want to know about these systems. So we do have a fairly formal training that we provide, which includes classroom, laboratory, and field components. It usually runs over 2 to 3 days, and they're very packed and very busy days. And from that, we do actually provide a type of certification, so we know the competency levels of individuals that come out of that, whether they're level 1, which is classified as very basic, or level 2, which is the intermediate or an advanced. The advanced groups get more into mapping, they get more into being involved in interpretation of their data, and they can also start getting into other research questions. And from that type of training, we will then say whether they get a certificate of achievement or participation or attendance, depending on what their level of competency was. A key underpinning of a lot of this is we need to know what the resources are. So one of the things that the program does support is baseline mapping. We need to know where our seagrass meadows are before we start racing out there and deciding where and how we're going to monitor them. So we did a lot of intensive field validation, making sure we know what the seagrass species are, how abundant they are, what type of associated fauna there are there. Are there things like green sea turtles, dugongs, manatees, whatever? From that mapping, ideally what we're trying to do is identify what we refer to as representative seagrass meadows that would be suitable for monitoring. So these are the meadows which may be those which cover the largest area within that region, which you can then say, well, I think if I sample here, it's going to be fairly representative of the overall population. We also identify who are the users of these seagrass meadows. That's very important, particularly if you're working in groups where there's fishermen. And we also look at what those threats are, because that can also be very important in helping us design the monitoring. And within those sorts of baseline mapping, we can do something at a very small scale at a site level, right through to something like a region level, which is 10 to 100 kilometres, or you can pretty much get to some country scales in there. So people need to make decisions about what do we know about our resource before we start rushing out there and starting to monitor it. When we start getting into the monitoring, so that's when we're looking at the status and trend, we do need to know what those represent. We want to monitor those representative seagrass meadows. And then we look at the types of field protocols. So when we designed these, there were a number of considerations we did put in place. We need to make sure they are clearly standardised, that they are relatively simple so that people can do them fairly successfully, complete them within the period of time that they have. But not only are they simple, but they still need to be accurate, they still need to be fairly robust. And you do need to take into consideration issues of accessibility to the type of meadows that you're working in, and such things as occupational health and safety. So very early on in the program, we did trial several methods across a range of habitat species and abundances. So we looked at things like the visual estimates of biomass, above ground biomass, the Bron 1K, percent covered. These are often the more general and most popular methods to be used. We found that when you're going out and working with most people, that the type of technique that was giving us the better and more accurate data was in fact the percentage cover. So that is a very common measure that's used. We found that people could understand that and the data quality from that was a lot higher, so that's where the program decided to proceed. In terms of the program design, there are such issues we need to consider. That's the sampling strategy. So this is where we prefer to have a number of sites nested within locations within a region. Those sites need to be placed within the meadows. We don't want them just placed on the edges. They need to be better placed within and in an area which is referred to as relatively homogeneous. So we don't want big gutters or sandbanks or things interfering with our sites because that can include high levels of variability. We do have all the sites not only replicated, but they're permanently marked, whether that be with a peg or whether it just be with a waypoint. There are standardised site layouts we use. There is some flexibility depending on those habitats. We certainly advocate non-destructive sampling. We don't want people ripping up seagrass. And certainly some of the monitoring occurs in marine parks where that's not even permitted. How frequent people sample depends on the questions, and the program has a very strong quality assurance and quality control protocols are in place, and particularly also dealing with the data management. So when we look at where we're sampling, we are sampling both intertidal and subtidal, so we understand there's a range of seagrass habitats, particularly in coastal and in those subtidal areas where you can access them as well. These are just a number of the key designs that we use in terms of the site layouts. The two main things that we're looking for with our site layouts is we need to have at least 30 to 33 quadrats, that's our standard measure, within each of our sites. And then we need to make sure that there's no spatial autocorrelation within or between if you're using transects. Remember, we want this to be fairly homogeneous. We want very low variability, so we are really looking at things like minimal detectable difference, which is smaller than 20%, and that's at the 5% level of significance, which is around about 80% power. So we need to make sure if you're going to go out there monitoring this data that you can actually not only do it correctly, but the data is going to give us something meaningful. No matter what sampling site design you may use, what we collect within a quadrat is standardised globally. So we are doing things like percentage cover. We do recognise that very low percentage covers, and even for some of our structurally large species, percentage cover is modified using a shoot count method. I won't go into that. Other information we collect is on the species that are present, canopy height, looking at other pressures like macroalgae, epiphytes. We look at the type of sediments, also record things like herbivore activity, invertebrate activity, because these aren't just plants, we're looking at habitats. We record other comments. Every quadrat nowadays is photographed. That's an important part of our quality control. And we also measure seed banks if people have that capacity. There are some additional things we do throw in. It all depends on the questions. Things like landscape mapping, looking at canopy temperatures, so sea temperatures within the canopy, the light environment, reproductive effort and potential, or possibly things like tissue nutrients. Overall, we've got about 405 sites that are currently mapped or established across 21 countries. Monitoring is currently occurring at 247. Some of those have been archived because the questions have been answered while they were originally set up. Some places are still identifying their resources. The data that comes in remains the property of the people who collected it, and the data is submitted that we can use it for condition and trend reporting. And as you can see there, in terms of this is the total data that comes in. Most of it is coming in by scientists or scientists where they have community or citizen scientists assisting them. So this is where we're saying it's really a participatory monitoring program. This is some of our sites, and what I wanted to do was have a look at a few of those sites just to wrap up. So this is some data that comes from Florida, the Pacific, Australia, Southeast Asia, and also the UK. This is some of the information that's come from which has chose 54 sites, just haphazardly chose those, no particular reason. I just want to get a bit of a spread. We can see that this is long-term data for some sites, so they've had like 20 to 21 years of data. Other sites we put a condition had to be at least 3 years. That looks like a lot of information, so we have run some generalised additive mixed models on that to look at the overall patterns. There's some interesting patterns in there, so we said, okay, what is the long-term trends? We ran a Mann-Kendall analysis on each of those, and as you can see, here are the numbers of sites which have showed either no significant trend or there has been an increase or decrease in abundance over the years. I suppose the greatest concern is when you start looking towards Southeast Asia, a place like Singapore, Thailand, we're seeing a high proportion of the sites suddenly showing a decrease. Other sites for the long term are showing some also interesting results. Overall, about 70% of the sites we looked at are showing no significant trend one way or the other. 9% are increasing, 21% are decreasing. The region with the highest proportion of sites declining was Southeast Asia, and one of those was Singapore, which is, you might of interest, and certainly I would advocate going and listening to Mus's talk later in the week where he's talking about the distribution of seagrass has also been declining in this region. Other places like Fiji, long-term data set, but it's showing no trend and actually relatively stable to a degree. Other sites are showing some increase. Across the places like the Great Barrier Reef, we're seeing no particular trend. And what we do notice is you need at least 6 to 10 years of data before you can really start getting a handle on what these systems are doing. We have looked at things like abundance guidelines to say whether can you tell using that whether things are in a good, fair or poor. I won't go into detail, but that we do have some approaches you can use for that, where we can look at these systems and give it a quick grade. That then is being used to flow on to produce things like report cards to get that message about condition of seagrass to the general population, and we've certainly done those for the Great Barrier Reef and places like Broome. The data itself is of high quality, and there's about 10 to 20 scientific publications that are out there, as well as numerous reports. And we also have our website, which has quite a lot of information on it. It not only provides information for outreach, but very important information on feedback. So people who are collecting this data want to know what their data looks like and what's being used for. So in terms of making sure that people want to continue with it, it's important that the data is of good quality, that resources and time is not being wasted, and that their information is being used. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you.